All right. Well, thank you very much, Masood. It's a great honor to be here and to speak to you on this topic. One of the things that Masood and I have been talking a lot about is computational sciences, and in particular what the challenges are for data in trying to take into account all of the different simulations and models that come out. And so today I want to talk a little bit about the data challenges for energy and environmental applications, which is a large percentage of the work that we do today. Turn this on. So to start off, this is work that is really from a large number of people working at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, so I need to acknowledge them. Wes Bethel is the group lead in the visualization group. You'll see some very nice movies that came out of that group. Ari Shoshani in the Scientific Data Management Group has been working very heavily in what is known as the Scientific Data Management Center, which is funded by the Department of Energy. And then John Bell and the Center for Computational Science and Engineering have been doing some fantastic work on combustion. You'll see some of their work also. And then there are many other people that have contributed to this set of slides, so I want to make sure to give them credit. And I'll try to remember to do that as the slides come up, but if I forget, there they are. All right, so I started off talking about computational sciences because this is one of the major drivers now in the work that we do at the lab. And I like to do this kind of a comparison to just sort of give you a feeling for the kinds of where we've been and where we're going. And what I'd like to start off with is, does anybody, first off, recognize what this little device is over here? People at Berkeley Lab don't count, so. Well, that's the cyclotron that Ernest Orlando Lawrence first built in the early 30s at the cost of, I think, roughly one graduate student and about 6 months worth of work. It's about 4.5 inches in diameter, and it was to study some of the high energy physics phenomenon that he was interested in. So in the 70 some odd years that have transpired since then, we are now up at the level of a 27 kilometer circumference experimental device costing a little over $4 billion in US dollars. So if you do the numbers, it's about a 75,000 increase, either in the power of the equipment, if you'd like to think of it like that, or maybe just sheer size, if that's something that's attractive. So at the same time, well, roughly the same time, right around 1945, 47, people were starting to think about how to develop computers. And this is a picture of, now this should be familiar to the folks here, right? So this is the ENIAC. This is one of the very first, maybe the first electronic computer put together. I've been trying to figure out who all these people are, but I don't know. I think that might be von Neumann, but I'm not 100% sure. And I've never been able to find the captions for this. But at that point, that computer, which filled up this room, took on had the whopping peak speed of 400 operations per second. And as I like to say to some of the audiences when they get to be large enough, it's sort of like every person doing a multiplication or an add every second. That's sort of roughly the kind of computational power we're talking about. Now, sort of about 2 years ago, we have this little device over here. And if you don't recognize that, it's the IBM the cell architecture PC, chip, I'm sorry. And that has the peak speed of about 200 billion operations per second. And you'll find it in some supercomputers, but much more likely you'll find it in something that's very close to home, which is a PlayStation 3. So we've come around from a whole room back to the room, but now it's a much smaller device. And that's a 500 million increase in computational power. $400. I don't know what the cost of the ENIAC was, but I'm going to leave that alone. It's also not a fair comparison because in addition to the computational power that you get from buying one of these things, you also get a DVD drive and a couple of games, I believe. So that's really a deal from where we've been. So what has that done? Well, what that's done is that now people are doing a lot more modeling and simulation. And when you do that, all of a sudden you have a lot of problems that were originally pen and paper, if you will, or perhaps sort of more observational or theoretical. You can now start to take a look at really hard problems like understanding nuclear energy through some high-fidelity predictive simulations. You can start to take a look at trying to understand, for example, what materials you might use for new batteries to improve the energy storage. Understanding turbulence leads to understanding combustion processes, and I'll speak a little bit more about this in a minute. And then really far out biofuels as a way for replacing some of the fuels that we have, the carbon-based fuels, and even down to understanding properties of nanostructures so that we can design new materials for, say, solar photovoltaic. So these kinds of now problems that we can attack on a computer have obviously changed the way that we do science, and this is why we start to now talk about computational science as being that third pillar of science. In addition to theory and experiments, you now have the computational science as being a third way of getting science done. So what kind of computational science do we do at Berkeley Lab? Well, I've already mentioned some of them. Because we are focusing very heavily on energy and the environment, you'll see a lot of programs on climate modeling, solar photovoltaics, energy storage, battery programs. We don't do very much with fusion, just a little bit. But there's a lot of work on combustion, carbon capture and sequestration, and some fledgling efforts, but now they've gotten to be quite noticeable on biology and biofuels. And so you can see that the types of things that we tend to do are really trying to understand how we might improve energy efficiency in the United States, and also try to understand what the effects are of the types of energy uses that we have on the climate. So that has led the lab, and this is in through the efforts of our director, Paula Lovasatos, to develop a program called Carbon Cycle 2.0, which is to try to understand how we might be able to improve both the, as I've mentioned, the efficiency of processes like combustion. So the way to read this slide over here is on this side you'll see processes that have to do with the use of energy. So combustion being one of the larger elements that we use in the United States, and the after effects of that combustion, to novel types of energy like biofuels and maybe even artificial photosynthesis. And then what we'd like to call the off-ramp over here, which is to take a look at other processes like how about just using energy efficiency to try to decrease the use of our energy consumption, and to totally new non-carbon-based energy sources like solar photovoltaics and batteries. And so one of the arguments that I like to make at the lab is that all of these have a large computational component, and so I'll be speaking a little bit more about that, and then specifically about the data challenges that we have to face when we do these computational science problems. All right, so let's start off with climate modeling. So you probably have seen simulations that are very similar to this. This is one that was done at Berkeley Lab, courtesy of Michael Weiner and Mr. Prabat in the visualization group. And what's noticeable about these is, one, it's a global scale model. And you start to see very fine details. So you can start to see the clouds, and you can actually start to see things like tropical storms developing. So you start to see that there are a lot of fine details that you can capture throughout these models and simulation. Now, the other thing that you want to notice is that if you take a look at these types of models, you have to take into account things like the sea ice in the polar caps, and then the clouds themselves are going to have an effect on that. And the trouble is that if you take a look at most of the climate models these days, they're at a resolution that doesn't really allow for very detailed modeling of the clouds. In particular, what you will see is that a typical resolution for, say, the last intergovernmental report, AR4, used resolutions that was on the order of about 200 kilometers. So here's a picture of California. And as you can see, the weather in Fresno is just exactly what it is in Berkeley, right? Well, you probably can already guess that it's not, and yet the models had to take something like this into account, so it's a very coarse model. And so if you get down to a 25-kilometer range, then you start to get a little bit more detail, and you start to get more accuracy in the models. But what you really like to be able to do is get down to about a 1-kilometer range simulation. Now, that has various effects. One is, right now, we don't have very good cloud resolving models. So it's one of the things that needs to be developed. But to do this, one of the restrictions is that if you really want to make this a way for a computational tool to be able to ascertain probabilities of temperature changes, sea level rises, extreme events like droughts and hurricanes, you really need to maintain about a factor of 1,000 faster than real time for practical simulations. Now, if you do this and you work through the numbers, and most of this is just standard numerical analysis, you have to use Courant-Friedrich-Levy condition, you find that in fact you're very limited by the size of the model that you have. And so to be able to do this in any kind of a realistic time frame to maintain this kind of a criteria, you're going to need something on the order of about 20 million way parallelism. And we'll talk a little bit about where we're at right now. Hundreds of terabytes of memory. Really, you're going to need new computational methods. The methods that we have right now will probably not extend to that level. And somewhere on the order of 200 petaflops to an exaflop of computing. Today, we have on the order of about a petaflop computing. So you can see we have about 1,000 factor to go in to be able to do something like a simulation like this. This is not a 1 kilometer model. This is just showing the kind of model that we might need to go to be able to do these kinds of simulations. Okay, that's climate. Let's talk a little bit about combustion now. So combustion is, in the United States, I think it's pretty close to true in the rest of the world, we get about 85% of our energy through some sort of combustion process. So electricity, almost everything that you have in the United States, is going to be based on some sort of either burning of coal, natural gas, or other carbon-based fuel. In the US, it's roughly broken down into transportation and power generation. And it's about 40% coal, 40% oil, and about 20% natural gas for these two things. Okay, just some numbers. The U.S. today consumes somewhere on the order of 20 million barrels of oil, 60 billion cubic feet of natural gas, and 3 million tons of coal. Okay, now the good news is that as you can start to take a look at these things, you can see that in fact it's a well understood technology. Unfortunately, you can also see that because we're burning so much, we end up putting something on the order of 27 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And you can see, I'm pretty sure I've seen this curve here where this is the carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere going back about 1,000 years down to today, where all of a sudden it takes this really high rise in here. And the predictions go to something around 700 or 800 right now if you take a look at the business as usual scenarios. So what can we do about that? Well, one of the things that we've been looking at the lab is trying to develop better methods, but try to become more efficient. No matter how you look at it, dice it, slice it, we're going to be using carbon-based fuels for probably the next 50 years. So we better learn how to do this more efficiently and try to cut down on the greenhouse gases. So some folks, Robert Chang here in particular, has come up with some clever new ways of doing combustion, what they're called lean pre-mixed turbulent combustion. They have the potential to be very highly efficient and very low emissions. You can see them right here. What's really cool about this is this flame, if you go into the lab, literally dances on top of this burner here. And there's no burning going on down in here, and you can see he's actually touching, that is his hand. I've actually been in the lab, and you can sit there and hold that. And the gases come up from in here, they get mixed in here in a turbulent fashion, and then you ignite them, and then the flame just burns and it just dances there. Now, the problem is that if you do this, the system is very prone to instabilities from the natural flame, and it's very sensitive to the fuel. So the kind of efficiencies you get and the kind of emissions that you get are very sensitive to the kinds of fuels. So one possibility is to go into the lab and just try a bunch of different combinations. That's going to take a long time. You may not get the optimal solution. The other way we've been trying to do this is to work with Robert to try to develop mathematical models to be able to predict what the efficiencies are and what kind of combustions we can get. So from that, we've been able to do things like a simulation like this, which allows you to now understand what is going on. So you can see this is the bottom now of that flame, and you can see that you can see the turbulence coming in here, and maybe a little difficult to see, but it's swirling in here. We're using something called adaptive mesh refinement, which allows us to really force the computation into just the places where we need to. And in fact, what the figure is depicting here is the color in red is where the flame is. And it turns out that the turbulence causes certain what they call cells to be generated, which have an impact on the efficiency of the combustion. And so the question comes up, well, how does that occur? It turns out that the standard theory for laminar flow doesn't work in these problems in here. So the only way of doing this is to go into the lab and try a bunch of different calculations. That is up until today. Because now you can go in here and you can do these simulations, and you can start to understand, or you can see the detail that is going on in the flame. You can see the wrinkling of the flame, and you can start to understand how you might be able to improve it. And so this is now where we're going to take a step and say, well, how would we analyze something like this? Now, just to give you some numbers, this simulation generates a set of files. In this particular case, it's 250 gigabytes per time step. There's somewhere on the order of 200 time steps in this one movie. So if I did the numbers correctly, that's 50 terabytes to do this one movie in here. And so, you know, as you sit and you try to figure out how would I visualize this, much less try to analyze it to see quantitatively, oh, is there something going on in here that's different than what's going on over here or in this part of the flame, you start to understand the challenges now that we face when trying to analyze some of these data sets. And this is one of the larger data sets, but you can imagine that a lot of them will be on the order of 10 to 20 petabytes easily. And of course, as we start to become a little bit more sophisticated about this and we start to add more chemical reactions and make longer time steps, and longer simulations, you can see these things going to petabyte ranges. All right. So there's a challenge. So what's the computing landscape? So we got into trouble, let's say. Basically, it's part of our success, right? So we were very successful at using very large computers, using very sophisticated mathematics. Can computers get us out of this mess? Well, let's see. There's a recent National Academy report on computing performance. And they have, I won't go through the whole report, it's fairly lengthy, but several points that are worthy out of that report. There's an acknowledgement that societal dependence on computing performance now, whether it's any kind of technical innovation, science, engineering, defense, computers are essentially now a part and parcel of everything that we do. However, there's some major challenges that lie ahead. There's a fundamental power and energy constraints that are basically driving the way the computers are built these days. And that has led to processor speeds that have stalled. So you will notice probably, if you've been around long enough, that the processor speeds were going up fairly rapidly and all of a sudden they flattened off. Okay, and that has led to fundamental changes in the computer architectures. And so we need new algorithms that can exploit that parallelism. What's happened is that in order to get the large computational power, what we've done is instead of having faster and faster processors, we have slower processors, in fact, but we have a lot more of them. And the question then is, how do we do data analysis and simulations in that kind of an environment? All right, so let's take one case in point. This is the computer that we house at the Oakland Scientific Facility. It's, the name is Hopper. It's a CRAY XE6 with 153,000 compute cores. There are some other numbers in here which computer geeks love, but not knowing the audience, I always try to put that in sort of more general terms. So in terms of usable disk space, we have 2 petabytes and 217 terabytes of memory. So the disk space, so this is something we're probably all more familiar with, it's equivalent to 64,000 of the iPods, 32 gigabyte versions. Or if you are more into music, that's 2,600 years of continuous music listening for your enjoyment. All right. In terms of the storage archive, it's 50 petabytes, and depending on how you calculate this, it's sort of equivalent to about 10 Library of Congresses. So lots of data is the point that I'm trying to get the point across here, and it's growing. In fact, those storage systems or NERSC are growing roughly at about 1.7 per year. So here, what I've summarized is the I/O that's used by discipline and the storage that's used by the discipline. You can see pretty much why I've chosen some of the examples is climate and combustion are using a little over about 500 terabytes of I/O just on their simulations at NERSC. I should also hasten to add that there is 2 other large computing facilities that the DOE Office of Science supports, one at Argonne and one at Oak Ridge, which have very similar numbers. And then storage, if you take a look at this, ends up being somewhere on a little over 7 petabytes of data already in store. Okay? And again, it's growing at that rate. The I/O is roughly about 10 to 14% of the amount of the data that we store. And climate and combustion are big users. But one of the things that I'm looking towards is that the life sciences, which right now is say, a paltry 5 terabytes. Paltry is sort of strange in these days, but 5 terabytes. You're going to see life sciences probably grow at a very large rate. Now, why do I say that? Well, okay, one more slide before that. Okay, so that also means that the traffic between the network traffic is changing. Okay, so we do a big computation on some facility like NERSC. You obviously want to get that simulation data out so you can look at it, analyze it, and try to do your science. And what we've been noticing is that there's been a growth of about a factor of 10 about every 47 months. And so you see here the growth of the traffic over our networks, which is pretty similar to almost everybody else's. But there's been a real change in character. So the blue denotes small files. The large one reports the sort of the top 10 files transfers. And what you can see is that somewhere about 4 or 5 years ago, people started sending very large data sets. And so that's due to a lot of the folks like in the climate and the combustion facility trying to get that data out to analyze it. But other disciplines are doing the same thing. Okay, now back to the life sciences for just 1 second. This is the only slide I'll have about the life sciences, but I think it's important because I think it shows the trend for other disciplines. It turns out that it's not just modeling and simulation that's really generating a lot of data. Okay. Yes, we're using a lot of it, but actually observational sciences, high energy physics, nuclear physics, they've all been doing this a lot. But the one that's really impressive is the life sciences. What you see here is time and the sort of roughly capability in here. And what you see in the purple and the yellow line here is the growth, basically Moore's law for processor speeds and storage capacity. And you'll see them going up as we pretty much expect. The interesting one is this one over here, which is the sequencing in kilobases per day, which is what they measure genome sequencing devices. And that took a huge leap around 2005, and all of a sudden, you have more data than you can analyze right now. In fact, talking to the folks at the Joint Genome Institute, they say that in fact that the limiting factor now for their science is not being able to generate a genome sequence, but rather is the analysis of the data because they have so much of it. And so that is really outpacing all the computing and algorithms that we have. And so they are really looking towards finding new data mining and analysis methods. I won't say much because we haven't done much in that area yet, but that's going to be one area where you can certainly see that it's going to really take off. Okay. I'll say a little bit more. So we generate lots of data, we move it to our devices, and now we have to access it, right? It shouldn't just be write-only data, as we like to call it. You really want to be able to read it and do something with it. But the problem here is now that I/O, really the disks have been outpaced by compute speed. Here is the speed up now sort of compressed in the compute power. And going back to 1955, you can see that the I/O disk, or the disk, have been going up at a much slower pace. So even if we were able to generate all this data and put it out there and move it somewhere, accessing it to be able to do something with it now is becoming a bottleneck where it may take you several months. Actually, it could take you 2 or 3 times as long to get the data as it did to just generate the data. And so that actually turns out to be a rather large problem for a lot of large simulations. Okay, so the heart of the talk then, the data analysis challenge then. So just so that we're all on the same page, what I wanted to do is just say, here's what I mean by the data analysis challenge or challenges. We need to be able to explore the data that we generate. So try to do things along lines of dimensionality reduction, or other algorithms to allow us to explore the data in creative ways. Because really what we're looking at is we generate a lot of data and we're trying to look for patterns or looking for insights. We need to have data mining algorithms that allow us to go in and ask questions about it. You also need to manipulate the data in some way so you can get access to it. A lot of times the way the data is generated is not the best way to do a particular kind of science. Or in the case of climate, a lot of the data is generated through a model, a community model, but you may want to analyze it in different ways than somebody who has written that data out. And then just preparing data for visualization can be a challenge because you need to have that data in a specific format for doing visualization also. Okay. So then, for the purposes of this talk, what I'll do is I'll talk about only 2 aspects of that. Pattern matching and pattern discovery. And here what I'm looking at is I want to do some sort of an analysis where I'm looking for some known or expected patterns. All right, so I have a set of data and I know that I'm looking for where the front is on that combustion simulation, for example. Where is it that it's really burning the hottest? So I know what I'm looking for, I just need to kind of find it. But let's face it, a lot of times what we're looking for is we don't know. We're really just kind of exploring it to see if there's anything that looks interesting in there. So you might generate, again, well, maybe the climate model. You might run a lot of simulations. You have lots of different forcing conditions, and you're just looking to see if you see any patterns in there. So there you don't really know what you're looking for, and you're looking to try to find out if there's a pattern in there. So if we're going to go to the EXASCALE, which is now 1,000 times faster than what we have right now, the PETASCALE computer, we need to be able to do the pattern matching on the EXASCALE machine. And do as much of the analysis as possible as what we're calling in situ, perhaps even as the data is being generated. Now, that's awfully hard to do when you don't know what you're looking for, and so that could be one of the big challenges. But you may want to then prepare the data for pattern discovery, so there might be some pre-processing you can do if you have some idea of what you're looking for, and then be able to then do the analysis off-site. Okay, so here's one sort of diagram of how you might look at this. Let's say we're at one site, so let's say that's NERSC, so that's Oakland facility. You have a big simulation machine, that's that petaflop machine that I mentioned, and it generates a lot of files, which it stores in parallel file systems, and then maybe some of that gets put off to archive on tape or somewhere. You might have some experimental or observational data, maybe taken at the lab somewhere. And then what happens is you're off at some sites. So maybe it's here at Berkeley, maybe it's at the University of Illinois, it's some other place, and you need to get that data from in here. Now, of course, you neither have the capacity nor the dollars to be able to store something like this, and so you're going to grab some subset from each one of these, bring it to your own local storage, and then you do all the analysis there. So you write your papers, and everything is all fine and dandy, as long as you know exactly what that subset is. Now, as these storage devices grow, you're going to probably get a much smaller subset that you can take. Okay, remember, you're going to pay both for the network cost going through here and then for the I/O going up in here. So another possibility, as I've mentioned, is to try to do something along the lines of, well, you have the machine here and you're doing your simulations, and then you want to do some data reduction. So in this case, you're doing the pattern matching. And maybe some analysis to try to prepare it for the data exploration later on. So you still store it on site, and then you archive it. But now the subset that you're pulling out is much smaller because you've already done some amount of analysis and some data reduction in here. So now that allows you to do more work over here than you were able to do that before, because you have, if perhaps less data, it's probably more important data or more relevant data to the kinds of things that you are interested in. But eventually what probably will happen is that you'll probably have to provide some sort of an analysis machine at the same site where that simulation machine is. As these simulations grow and the storage grows, you're going to be paying a premium for moving that data through all the networks. And so what you may want to do is to do that analysis in-house where you have much faster connections, share it there, and then take that and then take a subset of that back to your local machine. So these are all proposals. No one, I think, has come up with the definitive answer to how to do something like this. But what I want to talk about now is just some of the things that you can do if you do things along these lines. Okay, so the one example I want to use then is what we're calling query-driven visualization. Okay, and here visualization I'll take to mean both the visualizing it but also the analysis of the data. So visual analytics, as some people call it. And so what you'd like to do is, if you're sitting at your desktop and you have a big simulation, you have a certain idea of what you're looking for. So you say, well, I'd like to find all the interesting data. And so what you'd like to do then is, how would I define what is interesting to me? Well, if I know the data to some extent, then probably I have some idea of the kinds of things I'm looking for. So for example, in that combustion simulation, I might look for all the places where the methane is above a certain concentration. And then, I want the temperature to be between certain ranges. So what this allows us to do, this is the query-driven part, is to say, I'd like to have a way of going into the database on the first site, doing some sort of a query and grabbing only the data based on those queries, rather than saying I want all the data in a particular region, see if I find something interesting. Let the machine do the work for you, find the interesting data everywhere, and then pull it back so you can see what's there. So you can quickly locate that data, and then pass those results along to both the visualization and the analysis pipeline. So how might that work? Well, I'm sorry, before going to that, so the hard part here then is how do I do the query in a way that doesn't take me too long, or it essentially dominates the cost of the analysis. And so there, you'll note that most of the data analysis today is really performed on a subset of the data because the algorithms don't scale the way they should. And so, well, that's okay because they were designed for much smaller data sets. But for very large data sets like the 50 terabyte data set that I was mentioning before, you're not going to be able to do a very fast query on that. So one of the technologies that we've been using is something called FastBit, which is a bitmap indexing scheme that allows you to take the data when it comes out, go through it one time, maybe as it's being generated even, and index the data set. And so now when you go in and you query the database, you're actually looking through the index, and it allows you to be able to increase your search speed, sometimes by a factor of 100 over other bitmap indexing schemes. The good news about this particular technology is that it can be shown to be, you can prove it to be optimal in terms of being able to find the queries as fast as possible. And it works extremely well for high-dimensional data. Unlike a lot of the indexing techniques that are used in, say, databases for business or other places, they don't have a very large dimensional data set. In the combustion data set, for example, you might have on the order of 100 chemical species. You've got X, Y, and Z coordinates. You've got all sorts of other things that are going on. And it's very difficult to do those kind of indices for that kind of scientific data. And so we can really go in and search billions of data values in literally seconds. So for example, on one particular data set, it might have been the combustion one, it takes about a third of the data, the volume compared, and it gives you about a factor of 10 increase in the search speed. So pictorially, what it looks like then is something like this. You have your data, and you've already run it through a FastBit indexing scheme. So you've already have an index in here. And what you then do is you query this engine for the particular data that you're interested in. So as I mentioned as an example, methane that's greater than a certain concentration, temperatures that are within certain ranges, maybe you add other types of queries. And then what you do is you come back and it will generate particular types of analysis. And so maybe you ask for histograms. And then you can do parallel coordinates and then take a look for certain patterns. And then that part gets visualized later on down the pipeline. Okay. Okay, so this is where the numbers I had before. So a brute force algorithm, which is quadratic, would take you somewhere on the order of 5 minutes on just 500,000 particles. And using the FastBit indexing, it takes a little less than a second. It's a 1,000-fold speed up in this particular case. So you can see where this might be really advantageous when you have very large data sets. Okay, so let's use it in a real case. So here is a variation on that combustion simulation that I mentioned before. And what we're interested in here now is trying to follow the flame front for a particular simulation. So here we're going to combine all the different types of things. We're going to first do a cell identification. We're going to grow a region, and then we're going to track it. So you go in here. So this is now, think of this as one snapshot within that particular set of 200 time steps that I had. And I want to now go in and query it. In this particular case, I want all the places with the temperatures between 600 and 700. And this particular concentration is greater than 10 to the minus 7. So it goes off and identifies all those cells in that one snapshot. Then what you want to do is do this for all the different time snapshots. And then grow those regions so you can follow the flame front as it moves along. Now, this would be unthinkable to do if you had to do this over all 50 terabytes. But now by being constrained to just the places where you satisfy this particular set of requirements, you can go through and find all the different cells and then follow them as they go through till you get just the regions that you're following and that you're interested in. Right. So I've left a lot of the details out, but a lot of the stuff is up on the web. If you go follow our web pages, you'll get more details on this. Lots of papers have been published on this. But I just wanted to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that you might be able to do if you now have these kinds of tools. Now, Another thing you might think about doing is, let's go back now to the dimension reduction aspect of this. This is fine if you have a whole bunch of data and you have a lot of parameters and you know which ones you're interested in. But what if you don't know? What if you're looking for hidden patterns or things that you might not really know ahead of time? In this particular case, we knew that there was a correlation between the turbulence. Remember all that wrinkling that was going on in the flames? That was caused by the turbulence and all these little cells that were generated. But we didn't know if there was a relationship between the turbulence and that cell formation. The cell formation drives the efficiency, so what kind of a pattern is available there? So there, what you're looking for is you're trying to figure out if there's some way to reduce that high-dimensional data set into something that's a little bit more amenable. And so what we're doing here is we still index the data set, but now we're going to use mathematical methods from topology, in this particular case some work by Gunnar Carlson at Stanford, to develop a topological metric that allows us to then quantify the different cell structures in a way that now you can you can go in and quantify it and correlate it to the turbulence in that particular simulation. And so this is what these little pockets look like in there. And these have different topological, it's hard to see this, you'll have to trust me on this, they have different topological properties, but that's something that can be pulled out through these techniques. And this is not something, I dare say, you probably would have thought about. We certainly hadn't thought about it beforehand. But you can pull it out by being able to do these kinds of topological measurements. And so what this does is it shows either a strong, weak, or no correlation between the different patch sizes, and in this case, the cumulative area, which then goes to the efficiency of the combustion simulation. So my major point here is by using the indexing techniques in conjunction with the new mathematical, the topological methods, it gives you a new tool for now being able to quantify what's going on in those simulations in a way that you can't do experimentally. And so the Robert Chang, who's been working with us, he's the experimentalist in that picture, is really excited about this because he can now try different combinations of fuels, different kinds of configurations of a burner. Go back in here, now you can quantify what the relationship is between all these things, and then he can look to see which one is the best one and hopefully come up with an optimal design for that burner. Oops. Okay. And then as the last example, one of the things that we know for sure is that as the computer architectures change, we're going to be going into a situation where we have higher and higher levels of parallelism. The computers will probably be made up of many cores within a particular node. There'll probably be different levels of parallelism, probably even using graphical processing units. And so we know that this is going to happen in the simulation side. We need to be able to do this on the analysis side too. And so we have been able to do some visualization. This is one visualization of the combustion simulation using a little over 200,000 cores at Oak Ridge, rendering a, I think in this case, I think it's it's just a combustion, but it's using a hybrid parallel rendering so that it uses parallelism at different levels using both the MPI and OpenMP and other types of approaches. And so we believe that doing the combination of all these different techniques and then taking advantage of the computer architectures, we can start to do fairly detailed analysis and at least get to the point where we can get on the same level as the simulations are being generated. Okay, so summary then. There are some very daunting energy challenges that are facing us. We've been working at these at the lab in many different aspects, both in the science and the computational science. I think that one of the next steps is to be able to really understand what we do with all of the data that we both generate observationally as well as through models and simulations. Those are really going to become, in my opinion, some of the critical elements in the analysis phase of this, if not the bottleneck in many cases. So for example, in the life sciences and sequencing area. And so we need to start to address these types of problems. And this is really just the beginning. I think there's some very exciting times ahead. There's some really cool things out there that we can play with. And I'm hoping to entice some folks in the audience and hopefully the students to work on these types of problems. With that, I'll stop and thank you very much.
Do we have time for a series of questions?
Yes, sir.
Just hold on. Excuse me. Why didn't you use that one?
Global climate change map or modeling, pretty impressive. Is there a place where we see the inputs, and have you calculated in the activity of the sun and the magnetic fields and the changes in those, along with any shifting of the Earth on its axis. I'm just curious if that's factored in the modeling.
Okay. So do I need to repeat the question, or Masood, or is that already going?
It's going there.
Okay, all right. So as they say on TV, I'm not a doctor. I just play one on TV. So I'm not a climate scientist. The folks that I'm working with, Bill Collins and Michael Weiner, I know have done an extreme amount of work on this. I couldn't answer, and so I'm not even going to try to answer what they have done and haven't done in terms of what kinds of inputs they've looked at. But I know that they've looked at a lot of different types of variations and a lot of different scenarios. So.
I know historically one of the big roadblocks in using parallel computing is being able to allocate the tasks to the various processors so they can all eventually merge together. I wonder, has there been any particular progress or any new methods to be able to use larger numbers of parallel processors?
Okay, so if I could summarize the question, so you're asking the question about the load balancing aspect of this. Okay, so that's one of the things that worries me all the time, because as we go to a million, 100 million way parallelism, my sense of this is that things that had never been an issue before are going to start to become an issue. So we've been working on those kinds of problems. There are several avenues that people have been looking at. One of them is to go right down to the programming model, to try to use some global address space type of languages to try to resolve that issue on that level. There's a lot of work that's gone into trying to develop very load balanced types of algorithms. The problem is that they're sort of going in complementary ways right now. If you take a look at, for example, the combustion simulation, the only way to be able to do that kind of detailed simulation is through something called adaptive mesh refinements. So what adaptive mesh refinement does in sort of a nutshell is that it places grid points in the places where there's more work that needs to be done. And so what happens is if you had a uniform grid, then you'd have perfect load balancing in theory. But because of the adaptive mesh refinement, what happens is you end up having lots of points in places that are maybe here and here and here, and that just wreaks havoc with your load balancing. And so folks have been working very, very assiduously to try to come up with better ways of load balancing that, and they've done a good job on that. Is it a solved problem? By no means. And will it get to 100,000 to a million processors? We don't know yet. One of the more interesting aspects of this, and this will be the last point, is that even things like the operating system start to become an issue. There's something called an operating system jitter, and just small variations in how the operating system works is enough to create really large load imbalances when you get to 100,000 processors. So I would say right now it's still an open question, and there's a lot of good research going on in that area.
So how much overhead does this bit indexing technique actually introduce into how much bigger do the data sets get? And does this somehow depend on what kind of queries you apply?
So how much bigger is the indexing versus the normal data? I thought oops. It's about a third more is what I remembered, but let me make sure I got that right. Yeah, so the indexes themselves is about a third more. So it's, whatever the data set size is, you'll get 4/3 of it. And that's I wish I had more time, because it really uses a very interesting compression technique. So it doesn't just do the indexing, it does a compression, and it's based on a very clever technique that was patented. And so that's why it's only a third. Most of the other indexing techniques usually about a factor of 2 or 3, if I remember, or 3 to 4 for some of the other ones. And so that makes it not only very efficient in terms of storage, but also very quick to access.
You were talking about generating lots of data and then transporting it from one location to another. So what sort of data rates do you require for that transmission?
Well, as any scientist will tell you, as much as I can get, right? So yeah, so I mean these things are usually you want to get 10 gig or something like that minimum, and so right now most people get 2 gig or something like that, but they're going to want some very high rates. So interesting aspect. I don't know if this is true or not, but remember I mentioned that the nature of the traffic had changed. There had been a bunch of little files, and now there's these huge files. So I think what's happening there is that a lot of people have gotten sophisticated about how they send their files, and so they start to use techniques like parallel FTP and other things like that, and so all of a sudden what used to be a bunch of little files all of a sudden get aggregated into one large file, and then that used to hog up all of the bandwidth. And so we've instituted some different protocols to give everybody a fair share on these networks.
So do you own the transmission medium, or do you?
Yeah, we do. Well, let's see how to phrase that. So we run the Energy Sciences Network. Let's see, what is it's? There's a term that they use in the telecommunications network. You can take it as we own them. Yeah. It's not quite right, but it's sort of it's a moral equivalent of a 99-year lease kind of a thing. And I hope I got that right.
So one more question before we set up the next speaker. So I think I'm just going to ask the last question.
Okay, sure.
So
you're paying for it, so you get.
So we are looking at increasing the number of the cores, as you mentioned. So it means that we're making it more distributed space. But we have problems that it actually has to run in a much bigger memory, in a sense. It's just not really in a sense that you do distributed type of things. And there are new type of architecture coming for the memories, larger scale memory, terabyte memories and so forth. So what that actually larger scale memory is going to impact what we are actually looking here, in a sense.
Okay, so let's see if I can paraphrase that. So number of cores are growing, memory is essentially staying the same. Right. So this is a big issue, because what's happening is it's every single node now is going to have to contend with a lot less memory than it was used to. Right. And what's worse is the bandwidth between the memory and the cores is going to have to be shared also. So that's going to have an impact on the simulations. So a lot of people have been working on trying to develop algorithms that are aware of the architecture, aware of these types of limitations, and try to avoid certain types of communication, and also try to develop ways of using less memory. So people are looking at this. It's not a solved problem. This is something it's still in the open stages, trying to figure out what to do with that. I'll tell you one thing though. It's the memory the speeds are not going up as fast as compute speeds. So it's the same thing as a disk, and they take up a lot of energy also. So a lot of the power in these computers ends up being in the memory.
So do you see that the bigger memories they come back for a certain type of the problems, like 2 terabyte, 10 terabyte, 100 terabyte of the single?
Depends on what you can afford, right?
Okay. So with that, I leave that one. And while we get in the next question, Jim, if we can actually set up your presentation.
One last question.
Yeah, we get that one while we are actually setting the next speaker.
Thank you. I was sort of very intrigued by this transfer between the data and the analytics and some sort of pre-processing. But I wonder whether that could be done adaptively. An example I have, not in these contexts, maybe you have something similar. You think of Cisco, they put elements on every device, washing machine, refrigerator, whatever, right? And then data streaming out. So at every level, what sort of pre-processing do you do? And you send something over, but when you see some events, maybe then what gets shipped over or the frequency keeps changing adaptively, right?
I'm still on? Yeah, I'm still on. So excellent question. And I think, yes, you're right, and I think we're going to have to go in that direction, because otherwise it's going to be it goes back to the trying to predict what's the interesting part. And a lot of it is, as the data is being generated, you really don't know. You have some notion of what you're looking for, but there's always, that's where the science is, right? It's on all those unexpected patterns. So, I think we're going to have to go in that direction, especially as I see the algorithms becoming more adaptive, both in the spatial domain, like the adaptive mesh refinement, but also when we've had adaptive time stepping for a long time. I suspect that all of these algorithms need to become adaptive because that's the only way we'll be able to do the truly realistic simulations. Excellent question, though.